Hi, everyone, and welcome to the President's Commission on Equity, the Diversity in 2020 Election Speaking Series. Our topics today are going to be November 2020 Equity, Engagements, and Elections. We have Dr. Amanda Gatewood here to discuss, as well as Dr. Andrew Sanders and myself, to go over some topics concerning the 2020 election and y'all. So let's jump in. Our first topic is diversity in the 2020 election. I think I would go with Dr. Gatewood on this. Do you have any specifics on things you'd like to discuss concerning the diversity?
Oh, yes. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So a little bit about diversity. When we talk about diversity, one of the first things that comes to mind for many people is racial diversity. And I like to push back against that. While that's important, it's also important that we have a diversity of thought and that we have a diversity in the candidates' educational backgrounds, geographic backgrounds, opinions on many of the controversial subjects. So currently we have the most diverse Congress that we've ever had in history. But don't get too excited. That's still about 20% of our Congress comes from a diverse background. So while we're seeing an increase in candidates of color and women and socioeconomic backgrounds running for higher office, there's still a lot of work to do. And so I'm excited to see how these candidates fare at the conclusion of this 2020 election cycle.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that we can look at here in San Antonio are some of our local elections. One of our outgoing congressmen is Will Hurd, who's one of a very small number of Black Republicans in Congress, very small number, and he's retiring. He'll be replaced by either Tony Gonzalez, who is a veteran who's running as a Republican, or Gina Ortiz-Jones, who's also a veteran, who's running as a Democrat and who ran against her in the last election and lost by about 900 votes. So the 23rd district, which is where our campus is based, is going to be a very tight race. And it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out and if that can in any way impact the balance of power in the House of Representatives. And then on the northeast of the city, we have another possible flippable seat in the 21st district, which was held by Lamar Smith for the longest time. He retired and was replaced by Chip Roy, who served one term and is now running against Wendy Davis, who is a very well-known Democratic politician in the state of Texas. She was a very famous filibuster a few years ago when she was in the state legislature. And that's an election that was decided by 3% last time out. So Lamar Smith's majority has shrunk considerably. So we could actually see 2 women elected to San Antonio area seats, and that would be quite significant.
So I kind of decided before this started that I was going to play the role of stir of the pot, just for fun. So I kind of want to pose a question to you guys about why that matters. Why is it important to have a diverse Congress, or Congress that's made up of socioeconomic and different demographic features that resemble their electorate? Why does that matter?
So I wanted to answer that because any student who takes the Texas politics or Texas government class, we learn about substantive versus descriptive representation. And so there is a lot of common question, why does it matter if Congress or our elected officials look like us? And I like to push back against that and say, you know, why wouldn't we want those who are in the higher office, who are making the policies that impact our everyday lives? Like I tell my students, presidential elections, while they matter, they're not the most significant in our life. It's more so the state houses or governor. So why do we want them to look like us? Because each of us experiences the world very differently. And it's our multiple identities, or this idea of intersectionality, our race, our gender, our socioeconomic, where did we grow up, our our religious views, all of those things, they help us filter how we see the world. And they also filter or help us decide what particular policies we support. So if you have all of the elected officials being one race primarily, which is what we have, or primarily one gender, then it would not be a stretch to see why it is that certain policies benefit the upper 1 or 2%. And then, you know, those of us who are at the lower income spectrum may not have our voices represented. So the reason why we want to have diversity is because we want to have all voices, all worldviews considered when implementing policy, because no one group has a monopoly on all of the answers. And so we want to have that plurality. We want to have different voices at the table in hopes that we can come up with a better policy, not the best, because we're still a work in progress, but a better policy.
Yeah, and I think that just something to add to that would be a topic that we're going to come on to, and that's to improve voter turnout. I think a lot of people feel disconnected from their elected representatives because they don't have that much in common with them. You know, there's a lot of talk about how wealthy a lot of members of Congress are, and that affects the way that people view politicians, and people start to feel more and more disconnected. And rather than being some kind of rail against the system, all it does is consolidates power, because an increasing minority of people are actually electing people to those offices. So we are going to come to that and talk about it in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned it. Did you have anything else you'd want to say, Dr. Gatewood?
No.
Because our next topic actually is going to be, let's skip to civic engagement since Andrew mentioned that. We have crazy low voter turnout, significantly low voter turnout, not only in the United States, but locally, specifically within Texas and state elections and local elections. I think we had, gosh, in the last mayoral election, San Antonio had maybe, 6 or 14% voter turnout? I'm going to say one of those two, which is crazy low. Why do you guys think that is? And what can we do to help increase that?
I think more students or more citizens should be required to take a Dr. Gatewood or Dr. Sanders class. I think it's part of it is the media and this idea of front runners, and some people feel like it's a foregone conclusion that the incumbent is going to win or that my voice doesn't count. I think that's part of it. Also, there has been a concerted effort to suppress votes. And there is a lot of movement, to close polling places, to increase voter ID laws, to restrict absentee voting, to limit same-day registration. And so all of those things have to be considered. But I think that if we did a better job of telling people the importance of voting, mentioning how I think Dr. Sanders, you mentioned Gina Ortiz-Jones lost narrowly to her by, I think you said 90 votes. Just talk about those types of things more. I think that may be a particular way. And I don't know if Andrew's going to tap into this, but the demographics of Texas is such that historically, so as political scientists, there are certain factors that we can look at to predict whether or not people are going to participate in elections. And part of it is, race, age, economics, and all of those things. And so the demographics of Texas lends itself to low voter turnout. But all is not lost. And I'm pretty excited to see what the voter turnout will be in the 2020 election, because I think that we have a lot of excitement on both sides, and hopefully that will kind of stir something up in people, and they'll, I don't know, are we voting in person? Well, vote, turn up to the polls.
I know in Texas, I bet Andrew can probably speak to it. We have a whole thing going on about mail-in ballots and whether or not we can do that in light of the current global pandemic.
Yeah, that's going to be the big thing, isn't it? Like how safe it is to show up to vote. And we had this back and forth between, especially the Texas Democratic Party and the Texas Supreme Court, where the Texas Supreme Court met virtually because of the pandemic to say that you can't, unless you fit the already prescribed criteria to vote by mail, you can't register to vote by mail. And one thing they did say, though, is that it's up to the individual to decide if they meet the criteria. So for health reasons, you could say, okay, I'm not immune to SARS-CoV-19, so therefore I am unable to show up to vote for health reasons. they're not likely to check that, but then obviously some issues arise if there's a massive increase in mail-in voting. And there are also issues inherent in mail-in voting in terms of, does the signature on your voter registration document match the signature on the ballot? And if it's not a perfect match, is that going to get rejected? Because these are the things that could actually decide elections. And yes, Texas is quite an interesting state. We did improve our voter turnout between the last two midterms. It was down around 24% for 2014. We got up to 45% in 2018. One of the things we need to remember about 2018 is there was a lot of energy behind the Beto O'Rourke for Senate campaign. And that really brought out people to vote across the board because there were Democrats or people on the liberal side who were energized by that campaign, and then that in turn motivated people on the conservative side to go out and vote as well. So that's still only 45%. You know, we haven't really seen a midterm turnout in the 50s and 60s for a long time. We do see a higher turnout for presidential elections in Texas, but not in the midterms. So yes, we're going to see an increase. I think we're going to see there's going to be some helpful things going on in terms of the NBA initiative to increase votes. So one of the solutions when the NBA players temporarily went on strike a few weeks ago was the NBA arenas are going to be used for voter registration. And if they're suitable, because it's not always a given that an NBA arena is going to be a suitable place to vote, as we've seen in Bexar County, where the elections administrator, Jackie Callanan, has had to explain to people that you can't just open up every facility to make it a voting place. But that's going to be interesting. The AT&T Center has been put forward as a place where people can register to vote and actually vote. And if you open up these large arenas, that means that people can vote from in a more socially distanced way. So you're not necessarily crammed in together in these smaller facilities. So that should hopefully help. But yes, I think the pandemic is going to be a big concern for people. We are talking about extending voting to make it 24-hour early voting around Bexar County, but obviously that's not going to be possible across the entire country, and certainly might not be possible even in the counties around San Antonio. So there's a lot going on, and I certainly think that the major advice for those watching would be make sure you're registered to vote, and make sure you have a plan to vote. Make sure that you know exactly when you can go. Make sure you have enough time, because there could be a long line. Make sure you're taking whatever precautions you feel are necessary, but make sure you're voting.
So we do know, speaking of the low voter turnout, specifically young people and minority populations are the least likely to go vote. Why do you guys think that is?
I think apathy, just not realizing and being fully educated on the importance of voting and having your voice heard. I think Andrew has kind of hinted at this, and maybe you did it with the opening prompt, not seeing themselves reflected in those who are elected. And so like I said, I just think education is the big thing. And just, recruiting a more diverse slate of candidates who can speak to the real issues, like tuition, lowering the cost of college in a way, talking about childcare for young moms and, things like that. Because, we're all dealing with that right now in the global pandemic, maybe increasing pay for teachers. I just think if the candidates who are running for office, if they can find a way to tailor their message to younger people, I think that's a way. But not to sound cynical, but I don't think that many elected officials desire to have an increase in younger voters, because that would push back against the status quo. And
Yeah, I find that in my classes when we talk about the relatability of all political figures, and you look at something like the Supreme Court, and you ask even people who would be progressive, you ask them, do you see yourselves in the Supreme Court? And they say, well, especially these older people, like, no, I don't. Why are they interpreting the laws for me?
Okay, so I did want to add one last thought there. A couple of times you guys mentioned that young people in particular don't go out to vote because they don't feel as though their issues are being adequately represented in Congress. And I think it's kind of an interesting catch-22, because the young people don't go vote, politicians don't spend their resources campaigning to them, addressing the issues that really relate to them most. So it's kind of like cyclical. They don't go vote, politicians then don't want to waste their resources campaigning to them, and it kind of goes around and around. So that can be very problematic. Maybe hopefully in the future we can see, we do know that millennial populations are now the largest demographic of people. So hopefully that'll change in the near future. But let's move on to voting rights and how that relates to the 2020 election, which we know is a big issue. Dr. Gatewood, do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of research. I know the Brennan Center does a lot of research on voting rights and voter suppression. And particularly now that we're in the midst of a pandemic and there's a lot of talk about voting by mail. And then there was the whole thing with post offices and removing boxes. There has been arguably a concerted effort to suppress or to limit access to voting. And I think that we are definitely going to see some of that continue in this 2020 election. But I also want to kind of, be a little controversial and suggest that the founding fathers themselves put in barriers to suppress the vote through the Electoral College, where we are giving states, in the rural countries, where the majority of the population is white, we're giving them the same voting power as we're giving the more populous, more democratic, often more minority, majority states like California, less voting power. So I think that there has been a lot of push to limit access to voting. And I think definitely those ramifications are going to be felt in the 2020 election.
I actually wanted to kind of go off what you were saying about the founding fathers. I don't actually think that's controversial. I think it's very blatant, outright. Federalist Paper number 10 specifically, Madison outlines why he doesn't want all people involved in voting directly. Direct democracies don't work. We specifically implemented a representative form of democracy to keep people from having the ability to vote on each piece of legislation. So you're right, and I don't think it's controversial at all. I think it's just a fact, that people don't need to hear.
But no, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you look at the way that our population is concentrating in urban areas, and for example, LA County has more people than something like 40 states, and that's just one county in Southern California. And that's obviously a pretty significant imbalance of power when you think about it per head of population. And there's a big conversation happening, and we have it in our classes as well, about whether or not the Senate can remain if we're going to have this truly democratic system of government. Now, the Senate, obviously, each state gets 2 representatives in the Senate, but that gives us a certain amount of power to states that don't have a lot of people in them. And if we're making laws for the majority of people rather than the majority of geographical space, does that mean that there needs to be some reform of government? So there's a conversation that we have in our classes. And going back to a point that you made earlier, people need to pay attention in our political science classes, because this is what we talk about. Another thing that's happening this election is the issue of felon re-enfranchisement. So people who have been convicted of a felony, have served their time, whatever that was, and are now members of society again, should they be given their right to vote? Should they have their voting rights restored? And there was a lot of talk this was going to happen in Florida, and Florida has a significant population, in excess of, I think it's about 2 million people who are going to have their voting rights restored in Florida. And then Florida decided not to do that, in so many words. And that's happening across the country. And, we need to consider, is our criminal justice system a system that's going to rehabilitate people to reintegrate them in society? Or is it going to be a system that just starts stripping rights from people because of something that they've done? These are big questions that we need to ask in the future. And this all comes back to that issue of, if you believe in these things, then you need to get out and vote for people who are going to try to implement these changes. Should the Senate be reformed? Should we start to include other US territories? There's a big movement for DC being allowed statehood, Puerto Rico, and a number of US territories. And the point was made by a member of Congress that if you give DC and Puerto Rico statehood, then that's going to mean that one party always wins the Senate and the other party doesn't, because you're adding 4 senators who are quite likely to be on the liberal progressive side of things. So there's a lot of big constitutional questions facing the United States right now. And these are among them, and certainly these are big issues for us going forward, not just in the election.
I wanted to go back to the felon disenfranchisement. I always push to my students because I know we live in a state, where we are very hard on criminals. And I know that the social construct of what it means to be a criminal, is such that we believe that they're undeserving. But I always tell them, when we talk about why America was founded, one of the main tenets of why we were founded was this idea of no taxation without representation, right? Am I remembering history correctly? And so our felons, when they have served their time and they come back, don't they pay taxes? So wouldn't it be, run contrary to why we founded our country if we are saying that there are certain citizens who are going to pay taxes, but yet they're not going to have a voice in their representation? And that just always baffles me. And whenever I present that to my students, I kind of get a lot of students going, yeah, you're right. And so that's just one of the things that I just had to add to that.
Some of them choose not to vote as well, right? Even though they're also entitled to.
Exactly.
So let's kind of shift gears here to our last topic about fact versus opinion, which we know has been consistently an issue in the last, 4 to 8 years, saying conservatively, mostly 4. How can we discern between what is fact and what is opinion? What is fake news and what is something that we really need to put on our political agenda? And I think this is a larger issue more with the structure of our media outlets in general. But how do you think we can rectify with the general electorate, the everyday Joe, what is different, what's fact and what's opinion? Who can they believe?
I'll go first. Not to sound so postmodernist, but all facts in some way are socially constructed. And that kind of goes back to this idea of why we want to have diversity in our representation, because the way we see things, the way we perceive things, they are all filtered through our worldview. Yes, this administration, and I always tell my students this and they kind of look at me, President Trump and his administration is not that far out of the norm of American politics. There has always been a stretching of the truth, omission of facts, sometimes for national security reasons, some for political reasons. Yes, Trump is a little bit more sloppy, perhaps, arguably, with that than some of our previous administrations. But how do we decipher what's fact versus fiction? One of the things that I always tell my students is to check the sources, right? You try to find those sources that aren't, politically backed. They aren't receiving money or support from either of the two major parties. And I always talk about the role of the media as the gatekeeper, and that the relationship between the media and our elected officials should be a slightly adversarial role. They should be asking those controversial questions. If the president or any of the candidates are buddy with a particular media outlet, then that maybe should tell you that perhaps that media outlet is not, telling all of the facts. And again, I put facts in quotation because there are a lot of things to consider with those things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you mentioned the way that we consume media these days, and I know that younger students perhaps don't use Facebook as much as older students or older generations, but Facebook has proven itself very unreliable as an editor of what is actually true, and they're letting a lot of these conspiracy theories, which can actually be quite dangerous, appear. And it's important that students remember that social media companies, if you can't figure out what their product is, then you are the product, right? And for social media, the thing that they monetize is your attention. So if they know that something's going to aggravate you and you're going to get into an argument with somebody on social media, they're going to make sure you see it, and then they're going to know that you're interested in it because you pause on the screen for 10, 20, 30 seconds, and they realize that you're obviously thinking about replying to this person who could be a complete stranger, and they're actually monetizing your attention. So they're showing you these things to aggravate you. I think that when you see something like that, what you want to do is to leave the place where you are and then go and try and find out more details. And you can still rely on newspapers. Unfortunately, a lot of newspapers are behind paywalls because they're not making, for the most part, they're not making money anymore. But you can go, and newspapers are more accountable to actual, you know, in inverted commas, facts than places like Facebook are. Facebook are just, they're just looking for attention. So you can go check newspapers, check a variety of news sources. And I realize that that's a lot of work when you're potentially dealing with 10 or 20 different topics in one go. But so it's really important that you are aware that when you see things on social media, there's usually an agenda behind them. And you can form opinions, you know, based on these things that you read, but it's very important that you try to make sure that you're getting as much information as possible. And that something's not necessarily right or not necessarily wrong just because you've seen it in a meme.
So I actually want to say a couple of things, but like I said, I'm going to be the stir of the pot. And I think the issue between finding fact and opinion is much larger. I think it's structurally kind of integrated in our media system. Right now, you can't have a media system that holds true to the values of civic journalism when they're also trying to make profit. Like Andrew said, it takes a lot of time to educate yourself. And we have a very capitalist, consumer-driven society. People don't have the downtime because we're kind of always working. We're, you know, trying to get our day going. At the end of the day, people aren't interested in doing something that's going to present more cognitive dissonance to them. They want to just chill out and watch TV. Usually they don't want to get themselves in a big huff and puff, so they're not going to watch something that they don't agree with. They're going to watch something that's more, you know, casual, something that they can relate to. So that's where you see news correspondents coming in. Don't worry, I'll do the research for you and tell you what you need to know about this. And since they have this trusting relationship with them, that's where you see the delusion of fact and opinion kind of merging together. So I think the issue is much larger than there's just being presented with opinion as fact. And really, it's a corrupted system in general by capitalism. So that's just my 2 cents on it. I could go on for hours, but I don't want to waste y'all's time or you know, have everyone roll their eyes. But to end, what kind of advice can you provide to our younger students when they encounter somebody who has a differing opinion or disagreement?
So I actually faced this week. One of my neighbors came uninvited to my garage to tell me why one political party is, you know, cares about African Americans and the other does not, and why, you know, Black Lives Matter and other things like that don't matter. But one of the things that I tell people is that politics is personal. There are certain things that you can't see at both sides to, and you have to pick what those issues are. And, you know, stand true in your conviction, but you also have to decide, do you value the relationship? I am a Christian, and, you know, part of my Christian faith is, you know, forgiving others and to try to live peaceably among others. And so what I have found is that there are certain family members and friends where I just don't engage in certain conversations because I'm not going to change their mind. They're not going to change my mind. And the relationship is more important than me being right, than my being right. So I just think that while you should not create a tunnel vision or echo chamber where everyone agrees with you, by all means, you should listen to a diversity of opinion. But I also say protect your peace. And if you find that, you know, conversations with certain people just leave you just really heated and upset, then maybe you should just say, hey, brother, hey, sister, I love you, but this is just not an area of conversation that I'm ready to. I'm not mature enough, or I'm not in a position to receive the information that you have for me. But I just want to caution, never get to the point where you believe that you have a monopoly on all good ideas and that you know everything and no one has any information to give you. So it's a balance. You just have to figure out what works best for you.
Yeah, and I think that to make this point in class, obviously in our politics classes or our government classes, we can start to tiptoe into topics that can be somewhat controversial in class, you know, in our class discussions. And I make the point to the students on day one that you know, if you think one thing about an issue and the person next to you thinks another thing, you're not likely to change that person's mind over the course of a 16-week semester. And the way that you can actually hone your arguments is to absorb the things that they're saying, and then you can either debunk them in a conversation with that person, although that could get quite aggravated, or you can just debunk them in your own mind, and then the next time you're having that conversation with someone who perhaps isn't set in their ways, you're better equipped to tell them, well, actually, no, here's what I've learned about this, and here's where I learned it. And you can, you know, give them that direction and just hope that they're actually open to being informed. Unfortunately, as a reasonably famous sports talk show host made the point, a lot of people don't want to get it right, they just want to be right. And that can make it quite aggravating. So I think, you know, if you internalize what they're telling you, if you go and do your own research, if you ask your professors, you know, we're quite open to receiving questions from students and helping them learn more about the issues at hand. And that's always a good way to go about it as well.
I like to also tell my students to remove the words right and wrong from their vocabulary when they talk about politics in general, because, you know, if you think back to our founding fathers again, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, people used to kill each other because they disagreed and things like that. So this is not the only time in our American history where there's been significant division. So we can get through this. We just have to remember not to be politically deaf and remove those right and wrong words, practice respect, practice patience, and we'll get through it. So thank you guys so much for being here. That's our last topic.